had to be Highway to Hell, didn't it, really? We went to Frio the other day, pay our respects to Bon, as you do. There's little kids playing on him. I'm not quite sure how Bon would have felt about that. But there was a little kid that was, is that the guy from AC/DC? It's like, yes. I think Bon would have been proud of that. This is great, isn't it? I'm going to start off, if you don't mind, I'm going to start off with a conference selfie. So what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, how am I going to do this, is could you do your best quokka face for me? This would be great. Oops, I'm not very good at this photography lark, am I? I need a selfie stick. Oh, this is rubbish. There we go. There we go. I'll just have the top of my head. Selfie sticks. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks for the mixing team. I mean, this is going to be an amazing couple of days. I'm really pleased I'm going to be here starting the show. I think we're going to be in for a fantastic day. And I'm really looking forward, actually, to sitting up there with you and listening to all the speakers, getting this over with. So I've actually put my slides for the talk online, and I'd like to hear your feedback. You can reach me on Twitter, and my DMs are open to everyone. So back in the mists of time, I studied fine art. I wasn't a graphic designer. So I'm kind of largely self-taught. So I'm always slightly uncomfortable about describing myself as a designer. But I call myself a web designer because that's something that I've done for nigh on 20 years. And I run a little studio where we make creative work for the web and for clients. And for the past couple of years, I've been talking at conferences about how I'm frankly disappointed with what I see as the current state of design on the web. So I've been talking about why I believe that design has been lacking in originality and personality, and has somehow been stripped of its soul. Now, not everybody feels the same way. Ethan Marcotte commented that there is an opportunity and a need to set up better models for criticism in our industry, but talk of the web's soul isn't it. And Scott Jale added that for him, the soul of a great site is fast, broad access and utility. And that type of comment makes me really sad. But I'm not surprised, because accessibility and performance and usability, they all matter. I mean, I understand that, but they're not enough, not on their own. Because the web isn't some utility. It's not a terminal that gives us answers when we ask it questions. And it's not just a platform for the digital products that we seem to be so infatuated with building. The web can, and I think it should, be a vibrant medium for creative expression in the same way as film and print and other media. You know, as web professionals, our work should be about much more than just the execution. The web should be both a creative melting pot and a proving ground for new ideas. Whether we are broadcasting news or selling products, creative thought is as important as accessibility and performance and usability. And I felt like a bit of a lone voice for a long time. I was sort of pining for conversations about creativity. I was longing to see creative ideas expressed visually on the web. And I tried really hard not to sound like some bad-tempered old man, complaining that website wasn't as good as it was in my day. Because trust me, it wasn't. Because back then we had guest books and hit counters and lots of little men who were constructing in GIFs. But I feel lucky in a way, because when I started working on the web, somehow we still challenged the idea of what a website could be. So over the past year, I've found out from articles and conference talks that there are people out there who share these concerns. So outside the industry, I've heard from clients who want to present themselves and what they sell or do differently, not because of difference's sake, but because they've come to understand that for a successful business or product, creative design is as important as responsiveness or research. And I put some video up of last year's talk on my website, and I talked about the reasons why I think the web design has been lacking in originality and personality and in soul. Because there's our fixation with designing digital products. Somehow we've forgotten that the web is a medium for communication outside of applications. And we've become infatuated with processes like atomic design and tools, including pattern libraries and style guides. And I think we're losing sight of what we're ultimately making. And we've also got this unwillingness to take risks for fear of criticism or failure. And our reliance on research and testing means that we're just delegating design decisions. We're abdicating responsibility for our designs. And also, our failure to understand art direction and why that matters as much on the web as it does in print. And that's the reason I want to talk to you today. I want to talk about what art directors do and how art direction itself can improve what we make for the web. Because what I'm going to cover applies as much to promoting digital products as it does to telling stories. And I'm going to share a little bit of practical advice on how we can make designs that are more creatively satisfying without compromising the accessibility or performance or utility that we should be so rightly concerned with. So what do you think of when you hear the term art direction? Maybe you think about responsive images, about presenting alternative crops and sizes and orientations to several different screen sizes. Maybe you use the picture element or the sizes attribute in HTML. These have become useful responsive design and art direction tools, but there's more to web design than just using tools. Maybe you think about those designers like Jason Santamaria or Trent Walton who art direct their writing by giving an entry its own distinctive image and layout and typography. This gets us closer to understanding art direction, but images and layout and typography, they're only the result of art direction. They're not the meaning of it. So if art direction isn't exactly those things, what precisely is it? In a sentence, it's the art of distilling an essential, precise meaning or purpose from a piece of content. Be that a magazine article or a list of reasons why to use the coolest app from the hottest startup, and then conveying that meaning or purpose by using design. And we just don't hear enough about art direction on the web for reasons that I'll talk about a little bit later. But it's well established in other media, perhaps most memorably being in magazines and maybe in newspapers. So I am not quite old enough to remember firsthand Alexei Brodovich's work on Harper's Bazaar magazine from 1934 to 1958. Not quite that old. I'm not fashionable enough to have read Man About Town magazine or to have seen Tom Woolsey's work, but I am familiar with Neville Brody's art direction for The Face magazine. I'm still inspired by this stuff every single day. And then there's the Guardian newspaper, and in particular Mark Porter's redesign from 2010. Magazines and newspapers have found the web challenging for many, many business and technical reasons. And they also often struggle to bring the same levels of art direction to their websites as they do for their print editions. Now, One exception is ProPublica, and it's an independent, non-profit newsroom based in Manhattan. And I can better explain how art directors work with writers and others to attract attention and then convey ideas and stimulate emotions by talking about this story. This was art directed for the web by ProPublica's design director, David Slate, and it won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Now, the next few slides show screenshots from the art-directed website design, and some people might find those images disturbing. This is the story of a woman who reported her assault to her local police department, only to then be charged with a misdemeanor for false reporting. And the story is even more notable because it was written by two journalists. And that in itself isn't unusual, but instead of merging the two voices into one, the editor kept them separate. And that's because one was reporting from the point of view of the woman, and the other from the point of view of the police. And in his role as art director, David recognized that the way the story was told across two timelines and by two alternating voices made it more powerful. So he emphasized them. The woman's story uses specially commissioned illustrations, whereas the police story just includes photography. And her story is told on the left half of the page, but theirs is told on the right. And the introduction and the epilogue are in the center. And this is a powerful story. And it's told more emotively because of the art direction. So let's compare that to another piece from ProPublica. This is produced for the web by Emily Martinez and Rob Waker, and it's about Joaquim Archivaldo Guzman Loera, who's better known as the Mexican drug lord El Chapo. This is a story about violence, and the specially commissioned illustrations by Tim McDonough, they communicate the violence with an intensity that would have been difficult to achieve using photography. And finally, there's Busted. This is an expose of false positives in police roadside drug testing kits and the effects on people's lives from being falsely accused of taking only cold remedies is told through the art direction. This testing kit image is really small, and it adds scale to the devastating consequences. Now, these presentations, the presentation of these stories and more, they all share ProPublica's design DNA. There's some consistency between all of them because they're set using the same grid and using the same typefaces. But they feel entirely different because art direction enhances the story without getting in the way. So I guess that a good many of you are sitting there thinking, well, what does this have to do with me and the kind of work that I do? You know, maybe you see art direction as an activity that's more suited to print than it is to the web. And some people might think that art direction is elitist in some way. But I don't think any of that's true. Stories are stories, no matter what they're told or through what medium. I mean, they may be thought-provoking ones, like these published on ProPublica, or they might be the story of your company and why people should do business with you. They could be the story of your charity and the good causes that you support and why people should donate to it. And then there's the story of your startup's new app and why somebody should download it. Because with all of these stories, there's a deeper message which goes beyond just telling the facts about what you do or what you sell. So go beyond what your company does day to day and think about what that means for people. Your product probably does everything that you say it does, but what does that actually mean for people's lives? Art direction is about understanding those messages and then deciding how to best communicate them through the organization and presentation of words and visuals. So, is art direction relevant to the web? Of course it is. Art directors use design to help people better understand the significance of a piece of content, and that's as important on the web as it is in print. In fact, the basic principles of art direction haven't changed much between print and digital. And I'd actually go further by saying that art direction is essential to creating cohesive experiences across multiple channels, so that the meaning of our content doesn't get lost in the gaps between devices and screen sizes. So former design director at The Guardian, Mark Porter, who I've had the pleasure of working with and learning from, he said, when you do a newspaper redesign, you're also designing a website, pages for mobile devices, and for apps. Conceptually, it all has to fit together, and it's about having a visual identity for a brand that works in print as well as other channels. Because as well as helping someone establish a relationship with the content that they're reading, art direction can connect them to the spirit of a publication or a brand. And one of the most important tools in demonstrating that spirit is typography. Now, Mark also said, good editorial design is firstly about making people want to read, and then about telling stories. And that truth applies as much to the web, if not more, than it does in editorial. Typography is key to a website's visual identity because it conveys seriousness or playfulness or youthfulness. Now, designs based on type can be difficult, not because typography itself is hard, because it is, but because typographic designs also need close collaboration between editorial and design, and that doesn't happen very easily among a lot of organizations. So, I could spend a whole day, let alone an hour, talking about typography, so I'm going to explain a few ways that you can use type to help emphasize the meaning of your content. Just a few examples. Let's start with block quotes or pull quotes. They are a clear example of where designer editorial collaboration can improve someone's understanding of a story. But we can move beyond ordinary quote marks and use other symbols to reflect the content or the personality of the publication. And quotes lead people into a story. And we can represent that through design by using the grid to outdent the quotation and then using a symbol literally to point the way back in. And we often draw attention to block quotes and pull quotes by contrasting them with the typography of body copy. But by using the same size and typeface and weight, we're saying that both are equally important. And in contrast, if we use a different type treatment and positioning to place that quotation at the center of someone's reading experience. And with Flexbox and now with CSS Grid, we have the layout tools to enable us to place this content visually, but still maintain an appropriate source order. Or we can allow quotations to subtly interrupt the right-hand reading edge of the type. Now, art director Neville Brody, he often used varying type sizes to emphasize certain words, and this can be particularly effective within quotations. And quotes can help make striking typographic designs by creating focal points and then leading people's eyes towards calls to action. But it takes collaboration between design and editorial to determine the length and the number of the placement of these quotes. Headings, they can demonstrate hierarchy and they can signal the importance of content, but they can do much more than just demand attention. Headlines can really help us set the scene, so we can choose typefaces that reflect the subject matter. So this is a story about Jules Verne, who's the author of Journey to the Center of the Earth. And this can be enhanced by a modern serif typeface. It could have felt just as at home in 1864 when this book was written. And we needn't always place headlines at the start of a story. We can place a headline after the first few paragraphs, and that turns them into a prologue. And this display typeface is based on a grid, and that echoes the grid that we create using CSS columns. We can experiment using transforms to position a headline slightly outside the limits of the viewport. and use really tight leading and tracking to create overlapping shapes that turn the type into a distinctive visual component. And headlines needn't be large to attract attention. Instead, we can combine small type with large amounts of white space. And this amount of white space feels luxurious. But don't forget, we need to keep it in proportion to screen sizes across different media queries. But we don't always need images to add visual interest to a design. Deconstructed text can be even more interesting, and we can use SVG and the picture element to make sure that everybody sees a design that's appropriate to their device. Now, in magazine parlance, an introduction or an abstract or a lead paragraph is sometimes referred to as a stand first, and we can use stand firsts to do more than just introduce an article. So here, the generous amount of white space between the stand firsts and the article, it gives a reader time to pause and take a breath before they begin to read. Or we can give stand first visual prominence by making it the only center-aligned piece of text on the page, and we can add an amount of leading that reflects its importance. And stand first can actually come first, so we can position them above the headline, maybe add some borders between those overlong lines of text, which draws a visual connection with the columns of text below. Or we can create a contemporary magazine feel by using generous leading and aligning the stand first within the columns of the text below. And we can emphasize the difference by aligning that text to the right. And alternatively, we can separate it visually from body copy by setting it using uppercase letters and improve the legibility by loosening the leading. Every element presents an opportunity to tell a story through typography. And readers will reward the time that you spend designing type with their attention. Every element, no matter how small, presents us with an opportunity to be creative. So, let's take drop caps that sit below the baseline. These are easy to accomplish using CSS, so why are they so rarely used well on the web? We can adjust the size of the drop cap across breakpoints, and on larger screens, we can maybe use that extra space available by pulling them out into the margins. But why be satisfied with plain drop caps when we can add borders and visually connect them with the art direction of the content or the design of the publication? We can make a feature of this drop space by replacing caps with symbols or with illustrations. And this is a modern twist on the religious texts of 800 AD. And we can use CSS shapes to wrap text around these irregular shapes. Now, initial caps sit on rather than below the baseline, and we can use either the same typeface as the body copy or something completely different that reflects the content. And using drop caps in more than one paragraph helps us to break up large blocks of text, and it draws the eye to the start of the next section. Or we can use pseudo elements to insert decorative caps and then absolutely position them behind the content. And we can use initial caps for more than just indicating the start of the first paragraph. We can add personality to headings too. We can experiment with typefaces that contrast, possibly by mixing the traditional serif cap with a contemporary headline. And in magazines and newspapers, you'll often find the first 3 words of the first paragraph emphasized in some way, perhaps emboldened or set in uppercase. And we might also use pseudo-class selectors to apply the same treatment to the entire first line. And this line dynamically adjusts in length, and it's perfect for responsive designs. Now, I've always believed that to make inspired design decisions, we need to feel inspired. And there's no better place to start looking at work than from designers that we admire, particularly from outside the web. The fundamentals of typography and layout and image treatment, they're exactly the same whether we're working in print or on the web. But that doesn't mean that we can just apply print solutions to the web, because our challenges are very different. So if we're going to avoid making retro designs or mere pastiches of past work, we need to look at other designers' work to understand the actual principles that they used, and also the context in which they were working. Now, people say a lot, the web isn't print, but you know, there's not much difference between print and the web unless we choose to make it that way. Now, Mark Porter said that design is being in charge of the distribution and elements in space. And those elements being headlines, text, artwork, white space. And coincidentally, it was at The Guardian in 1988 that David Hillman first introduced the first white space to a newspaper design layout. Before then, it had been restricted mainly to magazines. Now, when most people start developing a layout, they turn to a CSS framework like Bootstrap. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this 12-column even ratio grid, and grids like this have underpinned website design since the days of Grid 960, and is anybody here old enough to remember Blueprint? Oh, a few old people. It's okay, we can have a self-help group later. Now, this grid has the potential to create an infinite number of layout combinations. Every one of them is going to have its own unique characteristics. So this is a throwaway newspaper feeling coming from the layout because of the lack of white space. When we add white space and columns, we bring more of an editorial feel to the page. And images that bleed off the page are reminiscent of a quality print publication. So if we've got an infinite number of layout combinations possible, can somebody please explain to me why this appears to be all we seem to be capable of making? Now, I'm sure everybody has seen the parody sites, every fucking Bootstrap website ever, or John Gold's famous tweet, which asks us which one of two layouts are we designing today. Frameworks are a really easy target, but the problem with homogeneous design doesn't stem from Bootstrap's grid. Instead, it comes from our lack of imagination and our knowledge of how to use grid systems creatively. Because even ratio grids have been the foundation of design layouts for decades. They provide columns to structure our content, but they don't inform us how wide these columns should be or the relationship between them. And should the main content be 8 columns wide, which is twice the width of the sidebar, or should the relationship between column widths be closer? You know, in my experience, most designers make those decisions based entirely on guesswork. But instead of guesswork, we can use mathematical ratios to inform layout decisions. And using ratios is particularly relevant now to responsive web design. It's made even easier by layout tools like CSS Grid and Flexbox. So I doubt there's many people that haven't heard or seen the golden ratio. This is a naturally occurring ratio. It's been used in architecture and art and design for centuries. And the golden ratio offers us more than columns because we can use it to create golden rectangles. We can take a rectangle with golden proportions, carve out a square, and then the space that remains is another golden rectangle. And we carve out a square, and we create yet another golden rectangle. And these are perfectly proportioned containers for our content. And they suggest layout possibilities that we would unlikely create using guesswork. Golden is not the only ratio available to us. There's a really great tool I'd recommend to you called GridSet. We're talking to people in my workshop about this yesterday, so check out GridSet out. And there's also a close relationship between golden ratio and Fibonacci numbers, where the number is the sum of the two numbers that come before it. And we can create layouts by making those squares the size corresponds to Fibonacci numbers. And what looks like, at first, to be a random arrangement of these squares can quickly turn into a layout that's very distinctive when compared to what we see on much of the web. So in reality, Bootstrap's 12 even columns, they are rarely used for much more than alignment guides. But if we don't have to work too hard to create designs that are distinctive using Bootstrap's grid. So I can't think of many applications where we'd need to use 12 columns. So the first step is often to simplify. And we can turn 12 into 6 more manageable columns. This was the grid that was the foundation for our work on redesigning WWF's fundraising pages this year. So we had 2 demands for our grid. We needed 4 even columns for content that we could combine into either 2 or into 1, depending on the content. We needed a wider than average sidebar to hold the fundraising tools. So with that in mind, we divided that first column, number 1, and then added one of those 2 narrow columns to the width out on column 6. And this makes ample space for the fundraising tools. And using this simple approach, we made a grid that's flexible and layouts that are really easily responsive. So this is the home page from our fundraising website redesign. And what about that skinny column over on the left? We left that empty, making that layout asymmetric, which adds visual interest and energy. But we occasionally pull content into that narrow column to add emphasis to it. So this is where the map of where the remaining 880 mountain gorillas live in the world. And sometimes we use that column to indicate the start of new sections in a more imaginative way than Bootstrap's full-width fields, like here with this gorilla timeline. So good grid systems anchor our content, but they don't contain the items on a page unless we make them. So the templates that we use, they can speed up layout production, they can give our designs consistency, but we've got to be so careful that we don't make all pages, and therefore all websites, look alike. Because there's no reason why so many websites are indistinguishable from each other. When we use this grid imaginatively, we can create any number of distinctive designs. Standards and best practice are all good things in the right context, and we can leverage familiarity with certain types of content. Elsewhere, we can really make full use of our imagination to add clarity to our content through expressive layout design. And the possibilities for creativity really are endless, which makes it so much more maddening when we see countless websites failing to live up to their creative potential. And most importantly, failing to add meaning to their content through carefully considered art direction and design. So, at the beginning of this year, I worked with Smashing Magazine on some creative concepts for their anniversary relaunch. And during the process, we decided that a 6-column even ratio grid was the most flexible for presenting the editorial content. But sadly, the advertising that Smashing relies on was a poor fit for this grid because 1 column was too narrow and 2 columns were too wide. So the solution was to use an alternative grid made from 4 even columns. Now, nowhere is it written that we have to only use 1 grid per page. In fact, combining 2 grids to create what's called a compound grid is an established design technique, but it's so rarely used on the web. And these 4 columns are perfectly proportioned for advertising. And the lines created by the 4-column grid also informs the size and position of other elements, including these smashing conference promotions, which subtly interrupt the reading experience. And irregular shapes like this, they can draw attention towards parts of the layout and more usefully towards calls to action. And here we've got block quotes or pull quotes, and it makes it abundantly clear where to start and finish. Or we can add a 100-pixel border to the bottom of a block or pull quote to add visual interest with 0 impact on performance. Or we could use CSS shapes to extend a feature image into the content space and then overlay a caption by using SVG to create an irregular background. And finally, we can combine CSS shapes with the ghost of type elements to create these unusual column shapes. So far the grid examples I've covered, they've all been focused on the number and the width of columns, but that's only one dimension in layout design. A second dimension comes from what are known as horizontal fields. And the intersection of columns and fields creates grid modules and modular grids that offer another way to create imaginative layouts. So a modular grid makes it easy to determine the format and size of images, for example. And we can choose type that creates lines that are most readable within the right number of characters. We can use grid modules to inform the depth of white space between elements. And we can use the grid to create a series of page templates that are different enough for each other to avoid repetition, but they remain familiar. So, figure captions. They offer readers a meaningful explanation of an image, but they're also fabulous for accessibility and for SEO. Nowhere is it written in the rulebook that captions have to be below an image. That's mostly where you'll find them. So we can do something different. We can position a caption above the image. And this is really simple to do just by reversing the flex direction. And we can change the flex direction from column to row, and we can place a caption to the side of an image. And Flexbox makes it really easy to align a caption's content to the bottom of an image. But why stop there? Let's use the modules in a modular grid to create a long vertical caption and then add borders to emphasize the content. A strong image needs a strong caption, and it's areas like this that designers can really put their mark on a design. Or we can design captions that complement the style of the images. Or finally, use the modular grid to crop images and position them and the size of captions that we place over them. Now, David Hillman wrote that in its best form, art direction involves the art director having full and in-depth understanding of what the magazine says, and through design influencing how it's said. This means that for many organizations, art direction isn't something that's easy to accommodate, because an art director needs to work closely with an editorial team, because they're responsible for organizing and sourcing the content, and for commissioning illustrations or infographics or photography. In fact, art direction and design and editorial should be equal partners. But in our industry, for the past few years, we've made some progress in bringing creative and technical teams together, but it's much less common to find web designers and developers who work closely with editorial teams. But I think that the reason why we see so little art direction on the web goes deeper than that. When they're designing for digital media, art directors don't just design the visuals, they shape readers' experiences of an article or even an entire publication into one vision. And that vision is often deeply personal, and it reflects their interests and their aspirations for a publication. You know, the most well-known art directors put themselves into their work. It's opinionated, it's recognizable, and we can see their fingerprints all over the work. And that is something that goes counter to what we're often told, which is that a web designer's needs should come second to the needs of users. Strong art direction on the web or anywhere else means trusting in the instincts and the judgment of an individual art director. But lately, our instinct has been replaced by research. We've become so risk-averse that judgment now takes second place to testing. And to reduce our risk of failure even further, we've become dependent on processes like atomic design, breaking design into a set of predictable and repeatable patterns. We've turned simple style guides into complex design systems, and we've put pattern libraries at the center of our design process. Now, these pattern libraries do help designers to improve efficiency. You know, I spend a lot of my time now consulting with clients on how best to use them. And similarly, living style guides can help organizations maintain better consistency in user experiences and visual identities across channels. But a cohesive experience needs more than a guide to a set of patterns. It needs a singular creative vision, and that can come from art direction. Art direction can provide a strong set of design principles that are applicable to digital channels as much as they are to print. You know, we needn't look much further than Mark Porter's redesign of The Guardian in 2010 to see how content and design and development teams have followed his design principles and unified readers' experiences across apps and newsprint and the web. Now, occasionally, I will hear that designers argue that processes like atomic design and tools like pattern libraries or style guides are somehow incompatible with art direction because that demands flexibility in order to be original. But you know what? I don't agree with that because I believe that to be truly effective, these processes need art direction to make them meaningful. Without art direction, even the most attractive atoms and molecules and organisms and templates have little more than superficial looks to unite them. In fact, I think in the end, it's art direction that's the gravity that brings these atoms together. So, all of the typefaces that I've used for my talk were all designed by the fabulous Dalton Mag. Please go and check those out. Thank you very much for encouraging my bad behavior, and have a fantastic conference.